We just heard Lee Chambers talk about his transition from a traditional wired type company to a wireless company. Now, one of the things that you said, it was an interesting comment, your impetus for doing this was that your customers were kind of tapped out. So why don't you kind of talk about what that motivation was to move to wireless?
Well, part of the motivation was that we had basically, most of our customers were capped out around $200 that they were willing to spend on disposable income. We had reached a market penetration where we were starting to see no increase whatsoever, so we felt like the best way to continue the business and increase was to go outside of our traditional territory. Because we didn't have landline facilities in those existing territories, we felt like wireless was an easy way to get in.
And you used LTE, and it was a completely new experience for you because you're now a new player in the game. And why don't you talk to us through the process of how that went?
Okay, well, for starters, we didn't even have towers. So we had no idea how to get into the wireless business whatsoever. We started basically with some scrapbooks and pieces of paper, looking at some other phone companies around the area that had done it, and reached out to some engineering firms, and it was a slow process, but a good one.
Now, what about spectrum? How did you get the spectrum to do this?
We actually had some spectrum that we'd purchased in some other rounds. So we had spectrum sitting on hand that we had to use or either sell. We had not used it yet at that point. There was a transition and management change and stuff with the company, so the old manager basically left it in my hands to decide whether to sell it or use it.
And so you have the spectrum, and now I know one of the issues with some of the early spectrum was there were no devices for it. Right. But so how did you get past that problem?
Well, what we started with was we looked at the equipment vendors for the core to start with and found a good vendor that we had in place that had worked with some other phone companies around. They actually knew some equipment vendors for handsets, specifically the modems and the hotspots, and that's kind of how we got into that.
And you also picked a niche. Instead of going mobile, you went fixed, right? What was the motivation there?
We felt like trying to compete on a landline basis was pointless because that market had been picked off and cherry-picked for days, and that we were trying to really look towards the future. And in looking at the future, we saw most everything going data, especially with your younger generation. And we felt like if we were going to invest any of our money in anything, that was the way to go.
And so you also were going into a territory that wasn't very well served on a wired basis, right?
Right. We were going into a territory that a lot of the customers had even dial-up service in some cases, or satellite internet. So we had customers pretty much for the past 5 years that had been knocking on our doors waiting for us to come into their territory.
And how long did it take you then from the time you came up with a plan to the time you actually launched?
Start to finish was about 18 months.
That's really fast. I mean, given the challenges you had to overcome.
Yeah, it was pretty quick, but I think in the long run we did well by the customers, and they're very pleased with the service.
Now, from a return on investment standpoint, what kind of ROI are you looking at in terms of number of years type?
Anywhere from 5 to 7, depending on how quickly we get the customers up and running.
And from getting the customers, the perspective of capturing them, has that been a challenge?
It hasn't been so far. We are just in the initial first 6 months of it, so we haven't really reached a market penetration to where we've really had to push yet. As I mentioned up on stage a little while ago, most of our marketing efforts at this point is knowledge base, telling customers who we are, what we have to offer. We're going into territories we've never served before. So.
And this also afforded you the fiber in places you didn't have before, because you're bringing fiber to these towers you built, right?
Absolutely. We're starting to plow fiber into areas outside of our existing footprint, and we hope that in the future that fiber will not only be able to be used for our towers, but for other tower providers as well, and to pick up some businesses along the way.
Excellent. Well, that'll help pay for some of the infrastructure costs.
Yes, sir.
Great. Well, Lee, I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Operators, if you haven't already, register for the CO to Data Center event at ITS Fiber. It is next month, right after NTCA's Telecom Executive Forum in sunny and warm Florida.